There is a moment coming for a lot of people where the stories they were told stop matching the world they are living in. And that moment is already here for millions of women. For years, the promise was simple: work hard, be independent, follow your passions, delay commitment, and everything will sort itself out in the end. But what happens when the end never arrives, when the cost of living keeps climbing, when wages fall behind reality, when technology replaces jobs faster than new ones appear, and when the social safety nets people assumed would exist simply do not catch them? That is the moment we are living in now. And if you stay until the end of this video, you will understand why a growing number of women are quietly arriving at the same conclusion. That for many of them, OnlyFans is no longer a side hustle or a curiosity, but the final option left on the table. This conversation is uncomfortable, but it is necessary because what is happening right now is not about personal morality or individual choices in isolation. It is about systems, incentives, and consequences unfolding in real time. Across social media platforms, especially short form video platforms, you can see the evidence daily. Young women recording themselves in tears, explaining that rent has gone up again. Groceries cost more every month. Entry level jobs are disappearing, and the dating landscape they were told would be liberating now feels empty and silent. These videos are not scripted performances, they are emotional check ins from people realizing that the future they expected has quietly slipped away. When you listen closely, a pattern emerges, and it is not flattering, comforting, or easily dismissed. For decades, society told women that they did not need men, that partnership was optional, that independence was the ultimate form of security. Men were told that their attention was unwanted, that approaching was intrusive, that traditional courtship was outdated, and after years of being told to step back, many men did exactly that. They did not protest in the streets, they did not demand apologies, they simply withdrew. They focused on work, on hobbies, on solitude, on peace. What few people anticipated was what would happen next, because social dynamics do not exist in a vacuum. When one side disengages, the other side feels the absence eventually. And that absence has now collided with an unforgiving economic reality. In 2026, the cost of living crisis is no longer a talking point. It is a lived experience. Rent absorbs most incomes before food is even considered. Energy costs fluctuate wildly. Transportation is expensive. Education no longer guarantees stability. At the same time, artificial intelligence is eliminating entire categories of work, particularly entry level administrative and creative support roles where women have historically been overrepresented. This is not speculation, it is already happening. Jobs that once provided a foothold into adulthood are disappearing, and they are not being replaced at the same pace. When opportunity shrinks and expenses rise, people look for alternatives, and that is where the conversation shifts from theory to survival. For a growing number of women, OnlyFans is no longer seen as extreme or fringe. It is being discussed the same way starting a YouTube channel was discussed 10 years ago, as a digital platform, a personal brand, a way to monetize attention. Influencers normalize it, athletes normalize it, celebrities normalize it. When high profile figures announce accounts and frame them as empowering, entrepreneurial, and harmless, the message trickles down. Young women watching from small apartments and shared bedrooms internalize the lesson that this is just another online business. What is rarely discussed in these moments is the long term cost, the saturation, the reality of earnings, and the permanence of digital footprints. The truth is that the average OnlyFans creator earns very little. The platform is top heavy, meaning a small percentage earn a large share of the income, while the majority earn amounts that do not meaningfully change their financial situation. After platform fees, many creators are left with sums that barely cover a utility bill. This is not a judgment, it is arithmetic. The promise of quick money obscures the reality of market saturation. As more women join, competition increases, prices drop, and attention becomes harder to capture. What begins as a survival strategy quickly becomes a treadmill where effort increases while returns shrink. Yet, despite this, more women continue to sign up, and that is where the story becomes darker. When people choose options that they know are unlikely to succeed financially, it signals desperation rather than optimism. Many of these women are not chasing luxury, they are trying to stay afloat. They are trading long term prospects for short term relief because the present feels unbearable. In past generations, family support, community structures, or partnership might have buffered these moments. Today, those buffers are weaker or gone entirely. Independence sounds empowering until you realize you're alone with every bill, every risk, and every mistake. There's also a social cost that rarely gets discussed honestly. While society publicly claims to be open minded, private preferences have not changed nearly as much as public language suggests. Many men are unwilling to commit to or build long term relationships with women who have publicly monetized their bodies online. This is not about punishment or moral outrage, it is about trust, compatibility, and personal boundaries. Women who enter these platforms often do so believing they can separate their online persona from their real life, only to discover later that the internet does not forget, employers do not ignore, and future partners do not always look past it. Over time, regret becomes a common theme. Women speak about shame, sadness, and the realization that what was framed as empowerment felt hollow once the initial attention faded. Validation is fleeting, but consequences are durable. Screenshots circulate, content is saved, names resurface. What was once presented as control begins to feel like exposure. This emotional toll compounds the financial disappointment, creating a cycle that is difficult to escape. Ironically, many women who leave these platforms speak about turning toward faith or religion afterward. This pattern is not new. Throughout history, when people hit personal rock bottom, they often search for meaning, structure, and forgiveness. Religion offers a framework for rebuilding identity after fragmentation. This is not an attack, it is an observation. When a culture promises liberation and delivers isolation, people look elsewhere for grounding. For some women, OnlyFans represents the end of one narrative and the beginning of another, but that transition is rarely smooth or painless. Meanwhile, men are not returning to fill the gaps. This is the part that many people still struggle to accept. Men are not rushing back to rescue, provide, or stabilize situations they were told not to be part of. They have adapted to solitude, downsized expectations, and redefined fulfillment. Many have found peace in simplicity and self direction. They are not angry, they are done. The idea that men will collectively step in to offset economic hardship for women misunderstands how withdrawal works. When people leave quietly, they rarely come back loudly. This leaves many women facing a future with fewer safety nets than they expected. The combination of economic pressure, technological displacement, social fragmentation, and delayed family formation creates a narrow path forward. OnlyFans and similar platforms appear as accessible options because they require no gatekeepers, no resumes, and no approvals. All that is required is willingness. But willingness born from desperation is not empowerment, it is coercion by circumstance. History shows that when resources become scarce, people revert to the oldest currencies available. Attention, intimacy, and access have always held value. What has changed is the scale and permanence of the exchange. In the past, these transactions were local and temporary. Today, they are global and permanent. That difference matters. It changes how decisions echo through a lifetime. The uncomfortable truth is that many women were not prepared for this outcome because they were told it would never happen. They were told the future would be fair, supportive, and abundant. They were told independence was immunity. They were told that men were optional and systems would compensate. Instead, systems are failing, men have stepped back, and independence has revealed its hidden costs. When no one is coming to help, people do whatever they believe will keep the lights on. This is not a condemnation of women as individuals. It is a critique of narratives that ignored human nature, economic reality, and long term consequences. A society that discourages cooperation between men and women while dismantling family structures and replacing stable work with unstable platforms should not be surprised when survival strategies become more extreme. The outcome was baked into the premise. As the economy worsens and automation accelerates, these pressures will intensify. More women will enter saturated markets, chasing diminishing returns. More will trade future stability for present relief. More will experience regret once the illusion fades. And more will ask how things went so wrong when they followed every instruction they were given. What is happening now is not a temporary trend, it is the logical conclusion of decades of messaging colliding with reality. When you remove partnership, undermine community, devalue long term thinking, and automate livelihoods, people adapt in ways that are not always dignified or sustainable. OnlyFans is not the cause of this shift, it is a symptom, a signal flare rising from a system under strain. The hardest truth in all of this is that accountability cannot be outsourced forever. Choices matter, but so do incentives. When a generation is guided toward decisions that feel good in the moment and destructive in the long run, the consequences do not disappear just because acknowledging them is uncomfortable. Men listened when they were told to leave women alone. They walked away quietly and built lives that require less validation and less conflict. They are not turning back now. For many women, the coming years will involve painful reassessments of what independence truly costs and what freedom really means. The platforms promising easy money will not deliver security. The internet will not forget, and the men who were told they were unnecessary will not rush to become providers again. This is not revenge, it is reality unfolding without sentimentality. And as this story continues, the question is not whether more women will turn to platforms like OnlyFans. They will. The question is whether society will finally confront the narratives that led here or continue pretending that survival strategies are empowerment and isolation is strength. Because the longer this goes unexamined, the more people will learn the lesson the hard way. As the situation unfolds, what becomes impossible to ignore is how quickly social narratives collapse when they collide with material reality. For years, conversations around work, dating, and independence were framed almost entirely in emotional terms, how something felt rather than how it functioned. Feeling empowered mattered more than being protected. Feeling validated mattered more than being secure. Feeling liberated mattered more than being stable. Those priorities made sense in an era of abundance when jobs were plentiful, housing was affordable, and optimism was easy. But optimism does not pay rent, and slogans do not survive economic contraction. The reality of 2026 is that many women are discovering that independence without infrastructure is not freedom, it is exposure. When a person carries all responsibility alone, there is no margin for error. One unexpected expense can cascade into crisis. One job loss can become a spiral. One health issue can derail everything. In the past, partnership and family absorbed some of that shock. Today, those buffers are thinner, delayed, or absent entirely. The result is a generation facing adult responsibilities without adult level support systems. This is where the emotional tone of online content begins to shift. Early videos framed financial struggle as temporary inconvenience. Now the language is different. Words like exhausted, overwhelmed, scared, and hopeless appear more frequently. There is a dawning realization that effort alone is not enough when the system itself is moving against you. You can work harder and still fall behind. You can follow every rule and still lose. That realization breaks something in people because it forces them to confront the gap between what they were promised and what actually exists. OnlyFans enters this space not as temptation, but as perceived necessity. It is presented not as indulgence, but as pragmatism. When someone cannot see a path forward through conventional means, unconventional options feel reasonable. The platform markets itself as flexible, empowering, and controlled. You choose what to post. You set your boundaries. You are your own boss. These phrases are powerful because they echo the language of independence that women have been encouraged to value for decades. But the missing detail is that markets do not care about personal empowerment, they care about supply and demand. When tens of thousands of people enter the same space offering similar content, individual control diminishes rapidly. Algorithms favor novelty, intensity, and constant output. What begins as optional escalates into pressure. To stand out, creators feel compelled to do more, post more, and reveal more. Boundaries erode not because someone forces them, but because the market rewards those who cross them. This is how agency quietly turns into obligation. And by the time many women recognize this shift, they are already invested emotionally, financially, and publicly. Another rarely discussed element is how isolation amplifies poor decision making. When people lack strong offline communities, they turn to whore online affirmation. Platforms reward engagement, not long term well being. Comments and subscriptions create a feedback loop that can feel supportive at first, but it is transactional, not relational. When the money slows or stops, the support evaporates. What remains is the individual, alone with the consequences of decisions made under pressure and praised by strangers who have already moved on. This pattern is not limited to one platform or one gender, but its impact is uneven. Women are disproportionately affected because they are more likely to be displaced by automation in certain sectors and more likely to rely on relational and social validation. When those channels dry up or become monetized, the emotional cost compounds. Men, meanwhile, are responding to similar pressures differently. Many are simplifying, reducing expenses, opting out of competition, and lowering expectations. They are not chasing status or validation to the same degree. They are retreating from systems that feel hostile or unproductive. This divergence creates a widening gap in lived experience. Women feel abandoned by both systems and men. Men feel relieved to be free from expectations they never agreed to. Neither side feels heard by the other. And the middle ground where cooperation once existed is increasingly empty. This is not because people are cruel, but because incentives shape behavior. When engagement is punished and withdrawal is rewarded, withdrawal becomes rational. The idea that men will return to traditional roles under economic stress misunderstands modern male psychology. Many men have already adjusted to living with less. They share apartments, delay milestones, and prioritize peace over progress. They have seen what happens when they invest heavily in systems that offer little in return. The promise of being needed is no longer enough to motivate sacrifice. Trust, once broken repeatedly, is difficult to restore. For women facing rising costs and shrinking options, this creates a harsh paradox. They were encouraged to become independent, and now independence leaves them alone. They were told partnership was optional, and now partnership is unavailable. They were assured opportunity would expand, and instead it has narrowed. In that environment, choosing OnlyFans is less about desire and more about perceived inevitability. When people say it feels like the only option, they are not exaggerating, they are describing a constrained decision space. What makes this even more tragic is that the decision often fails to deliver what is promised. The average earnings figures tell part of the story, but not all of it. Time investment is enormous. Emotional labor is constant. Boundaries require active defense. Burnout is common. And because income is unpredictable, stress remains high even during good months. This is not stability, it is volatility disguised as flexibility. Long term planning becomes nearly impossible in such conditions. Saving is difficult. Career progression is unclear. Exit strategies are vague. Many women assume they can stop whenever they want, but leaving a platform does not erase its existence. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Future employers, partners, and even family members may eventually discover what was posted. The weight of that knowledge creates anxiety that lingers long after the account is deleted. As regret stories surface, they are often dismissed as exceptions or personal failures. But when patterns repeat across thousands of individuals, they deserve serious examination. Shame and sadness do not arise in a vacuum. They emerge when expectations clash with reality. Women who believed they were gaining control often realize later that they were trading one form of dependence for another, dependence on algorithms, subscribers, and constant performance. The turn toward religion or spirituality after leaving these platforms is not coincidence. When people feel fragmented, exposed, and exhausted, they seek narratives that offer forgiveness, meaning, and restoration. Faith provides structure where chaos dominated. It offers rules where ambiguity reigned. It promises redemption where platforms offered only consumption. This shift reflects a deeper hunger for stability that modern systems have failed to satisfy. Yet, even as individuals seek healing, the broader conditions remain unchanged. The economy continues to strain. Automation accelerates. Housing remains expensive. Social trust erodes. Without structural change, more people will cycle through the same stages: optimism, desperation, compromise, regret, and rebuilding. Each cycle extracts a toll that is difficult to measure but deeply felt. The most difficult part of this conversation is acknowledging shared responsibility. It is tempting to assign blame entirely to one group or another, but that avoids the harder truth. Cultural messaging shaped expectations, economic systems shaped incentives, technology reshaped labor, social movements reshaped relationships. Everyone participated in building the world we now inhabit, even if unintentionally. Denial only prolongs the damage. For decades, men were told their presence was harmful and unnecessary. They internalized that message and adjusted accordingly. Now that their absence is felt, the expectation that they should return ignores the reality that trust does not regenerate on command. People who find peace after withdrawal are unlikely to re enter environments they associate with criticism and risk. Women, meanwhile, are confronting the limits of narratives that promised endless opportunity without trade offs. The idea that choices exist in isolation from consequences has proven false. Every decision shapes future options. When short term survival overrides long term thinking, the bill eventually comes due. This is not a moral judgment, it is a structural reality. The growing normalization of platforms like OnlyFans reflects a society that has exhausted safer alternatives. When respectable paths shrink, stigmatized paths expand. The danger lies not in acknowledging this, but in pretending it is empowerment rather than emergency. Emergency decisions should be treated with caution, not celebration. As more women step onto these platforms, competition will intensify further. Earnings will continue to decline for the majority. Emotional burnout will increase. Regret stories will multiply. And yet, new entrants will continue, driven by the same pressures and promises. This is how systemic problems perpetuate themselves by converting individual desperation into normalized behavior. The silence from institutions on this issue is telling. Governments struggle to regulate platforms without appearing controlling. Corporations benefit from labor flexibility. Media outlets profit from controversy. No one wants to confront the uncomfortable reality that a large segment of the population is being funneled into precarious work with long term consequences. What remains is the individual, making choices under pressure, guided by incomplete information and social approval that disappears when the cost becomes visible. The story is not about one platform or one generation. It is about what happens when economic stress meets cultural confusion and technological disruption simultaneously. If nothing changes, the path forward is predictable. More women will enter unstable digital labor. More men will remain disengaged. Relationships will become rarer. Loneliness will increase. And the narratives that once promised liberation will quietly be replaced by survival strategies no one truly wanted. The question is not whether this future is coming, it is already here. The question is whether society is willing to tell the truth about how it arrived and what it costs. Because pretending that desperation is choice and isolation is strength does not empower anyone. It only delays the reckoning. As more people confront this reality, another layer becomes visible: the psychological toll of living in permanent contingency. When a person does not believe in a stable future, every decision becomes short term. Planning 5 or 10 years ahead feels almost irresponsible when the next 6 months are uncertain. This mindset changes behavior in subtle but profound ways. Risk tolerance increases, patience decreases, and the willingness to sacrifice long term outcomes for immediate relief grows stronger. This is not because people suddenly become careless, but because the future no longer feels guaranteed enough to protect. For many women, this manifests as a quiet recalibration of values. Ideas that once felt unacceptable become negotiable. Lines that once felt firm begin to blur. Not because of ideological shifts, but because survival demands flexibility. When people say they never thought they would do something but felt they had no choice, they are describing a collapse of optionality. Choice exists only when alternatives are viable. When alternatives disappear, people adapt in ways that outsiders may misunderstand or judge, but insiders recognize as necessary. The digital economy thrives on this pressure. Platforms position themselves as solutions to instability, offering autonomy in a world that feels increasingly rigid. But autonomy without leverage is fragile. When individuals negotiate alone with global markets, the balance of power is not equal. Algorithms decide visibility, payment processors decide access, terms of service change without negotiation. One policy update can erase an income stream overnight. In this environment, independence is conditional, granted temporarily, and revoked without appeal. This fragility seeps into identity. People begin to see themselves not as builders of a life, but as performers in an endless audition. Every post, message, and interaction feels like a test. Metrics replace meaning, engagement replaces connection. When success is measured in clicks and subscriptions, self worth becomes volatile. A good month feels euphoric, while a slow month feels catastrophic. Emotional stability erodes under constant evaluation. Meanwhile, offline opportunities continue to contract. Traditional workplaces struggle with automation, outsourcing, and restructuring. Entry level positions vanish, advancement paths narrow, education becomes more expensive and less predictive of outcomes. The social contract that promised effort would be rewarded no longer holds consistently. When people realize this, trust in institutions declines. Cynicism rises. individualism hardens into isolation. In this context, the absence of men as stabilizing partners becomes more pronounced. This is not a nostalgic argument for past arrangements, but an acknowledgement of interdependence. Dual income households once provided resilience against shocks, shared responsibility, distributed risk, emotional companionship, buffered stress. When partnership is delayed or avoided entirely, individuals bear the full weight alone. Some thrive under this model. Many do not. Men who have withdrawn from dating and partnership often describe their decision as peaceful rather than bitter. They speak about fewer conflicts, lower expenses, and greater control over their time. This narrative is rarely acknowledged in mainstream discussions because it challenges the assumption that disengagement must be driven by resentment. In reality, disengagement can be a rational response to perceived risk. When commitment feels like liability rather than benefit, avoidance becomes logical. Women encountering this disengagement often interpret it as rejection, but it is more accurately a refusal to participate in systems that feel unstable. The mismatch between expectation and behavior creates confusion and resentment on both sides. Women feel unsupported, men feel misunderstood. Communication breaks down because each side operates from a different set of assumptions about responsibility and reward. As these dynamics play out, OnlyFans and similar platforms appear to fill multiple gaps at once. They offer income, attention, and validation in a single package. For someone experiencing financial strain, social isolation, and uncertainty about the future, that combination is compelling. It addresses immediate needs, even if it undermines long term goals. This is the trade off that defines desperation economies. The normalization of this trade off is one of the most concerning developments. When survival strategies become aspirational, warning signs are ignored. Influencers frame success stories without context. Media outlets highlight outliers rather than averages. The quiet majority who struggle do not generate clicks, so their experiences remain underrepresented. This skews perception and encourages more people to enter already saturated spaces. Over time, the emotional cost accumulates. Constant self presentation requires energy. Maintaining boundaries requires vigilance. Managing parasocial relationships requires emotional labor. When income depends on appearing available and appealing, personal identity can fragment. The person becomes both product and producer, marketer and merchandise. This dual role is exhausting and difficult to sustain indefinitely. Leaving the platform does not immediately restore equilibrium. Many women report lingering anxiety, difficulty trusting future partners, and fear of judgment. Even when content is removed, the knowledge that it existed remains. This awareness shapes behavior long after participation ends. It influences career choices, social interactions, and self perception. The past becomes a shadow that follows them into new chapters. This is where regret narratives gain traction, not because the choice was inherently wrong, but because it was made under conditions that did not allow for full consideration of consequences. When people act under pressure, they prioritize relief over foresight. Later, when pressure eases or perspective returns, they reevaluate. That reevaluation can be painful, especially when reversal is impossible. The pattern of turning toward religion or structured belief systems after such experiences reflects a desire for coherence. When identity feels scattered, people seek frameworks that offer clear values and forgiveness. Faith communities provide belonging without performance. They offer rules rather than metrics. They promise meaning beyond productivity. For some, this transition is transformative. For others, it is a temporary refuge while rebuilding. Despite these individual journeys, the broader trend continues. Economic stress does not resolve quickly. Automation does not slow. Housing does not become affordable overnight. As long as these pressures persist, new cohorts will face the same constrained choices. Without honest discussion, they will repeat the same mistakes, believing they are exceptions rather than participants in a pattern. One of the most overlooked aspects of this situation is how it reshapes generational expectations. Younger women observe older peers struggling and internalize caution. Younger men observe disengaged elders and normalize withdrawal. Marriage rates decline, birth rates fall, social cohesion weakens. These are not abstract demographic shifts, they are lived realities shaped by daily decisions. The long term implications extend beyond individual hardship. Societies rely on cooperation, trust, and shared responsibility to function. When these erode, systems strain. Healthcare burdens increase, mental health challenges proliferate, loneliness becomes widespread, productivity declines. The costs are diffuse but significant. Addressing these issues requires more than personal resilience. It requires reevaluating narratives that equate independence with isolation and empowerment with exposure. It requires acknowledging that technology, while powerful, is not neutral. It amplifies incentives that may conflict with human well being. Regulation alone cannot solve this, but transparency and education can mitigate harm. The conversation must also include men, not as villains or saviors, but as participants affected by the same forces. Dismissing male withdrawal as immaturity or resentment ignores structural factors. Understanding why men opt out can inform more realistic expectations and healthier interactions. Cooperation cannot be rebuilt without mutual recognition of risk and reward. For women currently facing these decisions, the message is not condemnation, but caution. Survival choices deserve empathy, but they also deserve honesty. Platforms that promise control often deliver dependency. Income that appears flexible may be unstable. Validation that feels supportive may be transactional. These realities should be part of the conversation, not hidden beneath slogans. As the digital economy evolves, new forms of precarious work will emerge. OnlyFans is one manifestation, not the endpoint. Gig labor, content creation, and algorithmic work will continue to blur the line between personal life and income generation. Without safeguards, individuals will continue to shoulder disproportionate risk. The silence from leadership on these trends suggests discomfort rather than ignorance. Admitting that large segments of the population are turning to unstable work for survival challenges optimistic narratives. It forces acknowledgement of systemic failure. Avoidance delays solutions but does not prevent consequences. Ultimately, the story unfolding is one of adaptation under constraint. People are responding rationally to irrational conditions. They are doing what they believe will keep them afloat. Judging these responses without addressing the conditions that produce them misses the point. The question is not why individuals make these choices, but why so many feel they must. If society continues to frame desperation as empowerment and isolation as progress, the outcomes will worsen. More people will trade futures for present relief. More regret will surface. More trust will erode. The cost will not be evenly distributed, but it will be widely felt. And this is not a call to return to the past, but a call to confront the present honestly. Sustainable independence requires support structures. Empowerment requires informed consent. Freedom requires options. Without these, the choices people make reflect survival, not aspiration. And as this reality becomes harder to ignore, the narratives that once guided behavior will either evolve or collapse entirely. The question is whether that evolution will happen through deliberate reflection or through accumulated pain. As this reality settles in, something else begins to surface beneath the financial and social pressures. Quiet sense of disorientation. Many women are not just struggling materially, they are struggling to understand how the world they prepared for no longer exists. They did everything they were told would lead to security. They pursued education. They delayed commitment. They prioritized self development. They followed cultural signals that promised freedom and fulfillment. Yet the outcome feels inverted. Instead of stability, there is fragility. Instead of choice, there is constraint. Instead of partnership, there is isolation. That cognitive dissonance creates emotional strain that cannot be resolved with surface level explanations. When people feel misled, trust erodes not only in institutions, but in their own judgment. Doubt creeps in, confidence fractures. The question becomes not just how did this happen, but how do I avoid making another irreversible mistake? In that mindset, fear and urgency coexist. Fear of falling further behind and urgency to do something now before the window closes entirely. This psychological state is fertile ground for decisions that prioritize immediacy over sustainability. Digital platforms understand this dynamic well. Their messaging does not need to be coercive, it simply needs to align with the emotional temperature of the moment. Flexibility, control, independence, and fast monetization resonate powerfully with people who feel boxed in by traditional pathways. When combined with examples of visible success, even if rare, the pull becomes stronger. People do not need guarantees when they feel cornered. They need hope, even if it is fragile. What is rarely acknowledged is how unevenly hope is distributed. Those who succeed early often benefit from timing, novelty, or external amplification. Late entrants face a different landscape entirely. Saturation turns opportunity into competition. Algorithms reward those who already have momentum. Newcomers must work harder for smaller returns. Yet hope persists because failure is individualized while success is broadcast. This asymmetry distorts perception and encourages continued participation even when odds worsen. As more women enter these spaces, the collective baseline shifts. What was once exceptional becomes ordinary. Standards escalate. Expectations adjust. This escalation is not driven by malicious intent, but by market forces. When supply increases, differentiation becomes necessary. Differentiation often requires greater exposure, more intensity, and less restraint. Individuals may tell themselves they will not cross certain lines, but the pressure to remain visible is constant. Over time, resistance weakens. This process mirrors broader trends in digital labor. The boundary between personal life and work erodes. Identity becomes content. Experiences become monetizable moments. Privacy becomes a liability rather than a right. When income depends on visibility, invisibility feels dangerous. The cost of stepping back becomes anxiety about falling behind permanently. This fear traps people in cycles they struggle to exit. Leaving such platforms often requires more than financial stability. It requires emotional resilience and alternative identity anchors. Without those, people may oscillate between participation and withdrawal, never fully resolving their relationship with the platform. Each return carries additional emotional weight, reinforcing feelings of dependency and loss of control. This is not addiction in the clinical sense, but it shares characteristics of compulsion driven by insecurity. Meanwhile, offline social structures continue to weaken. Friendships thin as people relocate for work or isolate due to stress. Community spaces decline. Extended family networks fragment. When individuals lack reliable support systems, they turn inward or online. The digital world fills gaps that physical communities once occupied, but it does so imperfectly. Connection becomes conditional, belonging becomes transactional, In this environment, expectations around relationships shift dramatically. Women who once envisioned partnership as a mutual support system increasingly see it as uncertain or unattainable. Men who once viewed relationships as central to adulthood now see them as optional or risky. Darasida, this mutual retreat is not coordinated, but it is cumulative. Each individual decision reinforces the trend, making reversal less likely. The economic implications of this retreat are significant. Dual income households become rarer. Single person households increase. Living costs rise disproportionately for those without shared expenses. This further intensifies financial pressure, especially for women whose earning potential may be constrained by labor market shifts. The cycle tightens. Independence becomes more expensive precisely when it is least supported. As these pressures mount, narratives around responsibility harden. Some argue that individuals must adapt without complaint. Others argue that systems have failed and must be reformed. Both perspectives contain truth, but neither alone offers relief. Individuals cannot outhustle structural constraints indefinitely. Systems cannot reform quickly enough to alleviate immediate suffering. This gap leaves people navigating uncertainty largely on their own. The normalization of precarious digital work reflects this gap. When stable employment and partnership feel out of reach, people redefine what acceptable looks like. They adjust expectations downward and frame compromise as empowerment. This reframing helps psychologically, but it does not change material outcomes. Over time, the gap between narrative and experience widens again, leading to renewed disillusionment. The stories of regret that emerge later often focus on lost time rather than lost money. Money can sometimes be recovered, time cannot. Years spent chasing unstable income streams delay other forms of development. Skills stagnate, networks narrow, opportunities pass. When individuals eventually attempt to pivot, they find themselves behind peers who pursued more traditional paths. This realization deepens regret and complicates recovery. The permanence of digital footprints adds another layer of complexity. In a world where past actions are searchable and shareable, reinvention becomes harder. People carry their histories with them, whether they want to or not. This reality disproportionately affects those whose income depended on personal exposure. Even when content is removed, traces remain. The knowledge that something can resurface at any time creates ongoing stress. This stress shapes future decisions. Some become more cautious, others become resigned. A sense of fatalism can take hold, the belief that the past has closed certain doors permanently. Fatalism reduces motivation to pursue long term goals. Why plan if options feel foreclosed? This mindset, while understandable, further limits possibilities. The, the turn toward faith or structured belief systems can interrupt this spiral by offering a different framework for understanding the past. Rather than viewing decisions solely as mistakes, faith traditions often frame them as part of a larger journey. This reframing can reduce shame and restore agency. However, faith alone cannot resolve material challenges. It can provide meaning, but not necessarily income or stability. As more women navigate these transitions, the generational narrative around success shifts again. Younger cohorts observe the struggles of those slightly older and internalize caution. They may delay entering unstable platforms or avoid them altogether. Alternatively, they may enter earlier, hoping to capitalize before saturation worsens. Either way, the decision calculus is shaped by observed outcomes rather than idealistic promises. Men observing these dynamics draw their own conclusions. Many see increased risk in forming partnerships under conditions of economic instability and social uncertainty. They prioritize self sufficiency and risk minimization. This further reduces opportunities for shared resilience. The feedback loop continues. What emerges is a society characterized by parallel solitude. Individuals move alongside one another without deep interdependence. Digital connections substitute for physical ones. Short term solutions replace long term planning. In such a society, crises are absorbed individually rather than collectively. The burden is heavier because it is borne alone. Addressing this trajectory requires confronting uncomfortable truths. Independence without community is brittle. Empowerment without foresight is fragile. Flexibility without security is stressful. These are not ideological statements, but observations grounded in lived experience. Ignoring them does not make them less true. The challenge lies in recalibrating narratives to match reality. Encouraging people to pursue autonomy must be paired with honest discussion of trade offs. Promoting digital opportunities must include transparency about risks and averages, not just outliers. Celebrating choice must acknowledge constraint. Without this balance, people will continue to make decisions under false assumptions. For those currently facing these choices, compassion matters. It is easy to critique from a distance, harder to empathize when stakes are high. Understanding why people choose precarious paths does not require endorsing those paths. It requires recognizing the context in which decisions are made. As economic and technological pressures intensify, the need for collective solutions becomes more urgent. Affordable housing, accessible education, fair labor practices, and supportive communities can expand the range of viable options. Without such supports, individuals will continue to rely on stopgap measures that offer limited relief. The story unfolding is not about moral decline or personal failure. It is about adaptation to constrained circumstances. People respond to incentives and pressures. When safer options shrink, riskier ones expand. This is predictable, not shocking. The question that remains is whether society will adjust incentives to encourage sustainable choices or continue normalizing desperation as innovation. The answer will shape not only individual lives, but the social fabric itself. As these pressures converge, another difficult realization begins to surface for many women: the understanding that resilience alone cannot substitute for structure. Society often celebrates resilience as a virtue, praising those who endure hardship without complaint. But endurance without progress eventually becomes exhaustion. When resilience is demanded continuously without corresponding improvement in conditions, it stops being empowering and starts becoming corrosive. People are not designed to live indefinitely in survival mode. Over time, the nervous system adapts to stress by narrowing focus, shortening time horizons, and reducing emotional bandwidth. This is not weakness, it is biology responding to persistent uncertainty. In this state, long term goals such as family formation, career development, or wealth building feel distant and abstract. Immediate needs dominate attention. Rent, food, utilities, and debt take precedence. When these basic concerns remain unresolved month after month, higher order aspirations quietly fall away. This is how entire life paths shift without dramatic moments, not through sudden collapse, but through gradual erosion of possibility. People wake up one day realizing that the future they imagined no longer feels accessible, not because they failed, but because conditions quietly closed around them. The normalization of digital survival strategies accelerates this erosion. When peers frame precarious work as practical and inevitable, social pressure reinforces participation. Opting out feels risky, even irresponsible, when others appear to be managing. This collective adaptation creates a sense of inevitability that is difficult to challenge. Individuals who question the path may feel naive or out of touch. Over time, dissenting voices grow quieter, not because they are wrong, but because they are tired of swimming against the current. The role of public discourse in shaping these outcomes cannot be ignored. Conversations about empowerment often prioritize autonomy over accountability and visibility over sustainability. Short term gains are celebrated while long term costs are downplayed. This framing benefits platforms and media outlets that profit from engagement, but leaves individuals navigating consequences largely alone. When critical perspectives are labeled judgmental or outdated, meaningful discussion becomes difficult. Silence replaces scrutiny, and patterns repeat unchecked. Another layer of complexity arises from how these trends intersect with identity formation. Many women build their sense of self around adaptability and independence, qualities that serve them well in earlier stages of life. However, when adaptability becomes perpetual, identity can fragment. Without stable anchors, people struggle to define who they are beyond their current coping mechanisms. This identity uncertainty compounds stress and makes decision making more reactive. The constant recalibration required to survive in unstable environments drains cognitive resources. Decision fatigue sets in. Choices that once required careful consideration become automatic. When people operate under chronic strain, they rely on heuristics and social cues rather than deep analysis. If a behavior appears normalized, it feels safer. This is how trends propagate even when outcomes are mixed or negative. Men navigating the same economic landscape exhibit different adaptations. Many simplify aggressively, reducing expenses, avoiding debt, and disengaging from social expectations that increase risk. This approach offers a sense of control, but it also narrows life experience. By opting out of partnership and long term planning, men protect themselves from certain vulnerabilities, but also forego potential sources of support and meaning. This trade off is often framed as liberation, but it carries its own costs. The divergence between male and female coping strategies deepens misunderstanding. Women experiencing heightened pressure may view male withdrawal as indifference or abandonment. Men may view female engagement in precarious work as risky or short sighted. Each side interprets the other through lenses shaped by their own constraints. Without shared dialogue, these interpretations harden into narratives that further reduce cooperation. This breakdown in mutual understanding has implications beyond individual relationships. It influences workplace dynamics, political discourse, and cultural norms. When trust erodes between groups, collective action becomes harder. Policies that require cooperation face resistance. Social cohesion weakens. In such environments, individuals retreat further into self preservation, reinforcing the cycle. The idea that markets will self correct these issues overlooks the human cost of adjustment. Market forces optimize for efficiency, not well being. They respond to supply and demand, not dignity or long term stability. When people become units of content or labor rather than participants in communities, the system may function technically while failing socially. This disconnect fuels dissatisfaction that manifests in anxiety, disengagement, and declining optimism. For women who turn to platforms like OnlyFans, the initial sense of control can be intoxicating. Being able to generate income without gatekeepers feels empowering. However, this control is partial and conditional. Platforms retain ultimate authority over visibility and monetization. Policy changes, algorithm updates, or shifts in public sentiment can alter outcomes overnight. This unpredictability undermines the security that control was meant to provide. The emotional labor required to maintain engagement intensifies over time. Responding to messages, managing expectations, and curating persona blur the line between personal and professional life. Boundaries become porous. Burnout emerges gradually, often unnoticed until motivation collapses. At that point, stepping back risks income loss, creating a trap where rest feels unaffordable. This trap is not unique to one platform. It reflects broader trends in gig and creator economies. Flexibility attracts participants, but instability retains them. The absence of benefits, protections, and clear advancement paths shifts risk onto individuals. When participation is framed as choice, accountability shifts away from structures and toward people who lack leverage. As women age within these systems, the calculus changes again. Youth, novelty, and perceived desirability often drive visibility. As these attributes shift, maintaining income becomes harder. Planning for this transition requires foresight and resources that many do not have. Without alternative pathways, the prospect of declining earnings adds another layer of anxiety. The permanence of digital records exacerbates this anxiety. Knowing that past content may resurface complicates future transitions. This awareness influences decisions about career changes, relationships, and public engagement. The past becomes a factor in present planning, limiting perceived options. Even when stigma diminishes socially, personal concerns remain. Some women attempt to reframe their experiences as entrepreneurial training, emphasizing skills gained in marketing, branding, and audience management. While these skills are real, translating them into traditional employment is not always straightforward. Employers may undervalue or distrust such backgrounds. This mismatch between self perception and external validation creates frustration. The gap between narrative and outcome widens further. Individuals are told their choices were empowering, yet encounter barriers when seeking stability. This contradiction undermines confidence and fosters resentment. When systems praise flexibility but penalize its consequences, people feel deceived. The turn toward faith, community groups, or alternative lifestyles reflects a search for coherence. People seek environments where expectations are clear and values are shared. These spaces offer relief from constant self marketing and evaluation. However, reintegration into stable economic roles remains challenging without structural support. As younger generations observe these struggles, they adjust expectations downward. Aspirations become more modest. Risk aversion increases. Some delay adulthood milestones indefinitely. Others pursue extreme independence. Both responses reflect adaptation to perceived instability. The long term impact on social continuity is significant. Birth rates decline as economic and relational uncertainty rise. Families form later or not at all. This demographic shift influences labor markets, healthcare systems, and social services. The effects unfold slowly but steadily, shaping future conditions for everyone. The absence of honest public conversation about these trends perpetuates confusion. When individuals feel alone in their struggles, they internalize blame. Recognizing patterns can alleviate shame and prompt collective inquiry. Without that recognition, people repeat cycles privately, believing their experience is unique. Addressing these challenges requires recalibrating cultural narratives. Independence must be paired with interdependence. Flexibility must be balanced with security. Empowerment must include foresight. These principles are not regressions, but adjustments informed by experience. For women currently navigating constrained choices, the path forward is not clear. There are no simple solutions, but clarity about risks and averages can support better decision making. Honest information empowers more than idealized stories. Transparency can mitigate harm even when options remain limited. Men, too, must confront the long term implications of withdrawal. Peace achieved through disengagement may come at the cost of connection and shared resilience. Rebuilding trust requires mutual effort and realistic expectations. Without addressing structural pressures, individual goodwill is insufficient. The trajectory we are on is not inevitable, but it is entrenched. Changing direction requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about how we live, work, and relate. It requires shifting incentives towards stability and cooperation. It requires valuing long term outcomes over short term engagement. Ignoring these dynamics does not preserve freedom, it erodes it. When choice is narrow, freedom becomes theoretical. Real freedom depends on having viable options, not just formal permission. As everything discussed comes together, the final realization many people arrive at is not anger, but clarity. Clarity strips away comforting illusions and replaces them with something harder but more useful: understanding. Understanding that good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. Understanding that narratives can be persuasive while still being incomplete. Understanding that systems shape behavior far more than slogans ever could. When clarity arrives, it often feels heavy at first because it forces people to confront what can no longer be ignored. For many women facing the realities of 2026, that clarity takes the form of recognizing that the world they were prepared for is not the world they are living in. They were taught to believe that independence was synonymous with security, that opportunity would expand endlessly, and that personal fulfillment could be postponed without consequence. None of those ideas accounted for rapid technological displacement, rising costs, weakened social bonds, or the quiet withdrawal of men from roles they were told were unnecessary. When those forces converge, independence becomes isolation, opportunity becomes scarcity, and postponement becomes permanent delay. OnlyFans, in this context, is not a cause but a consequence. It is the visible outcome of invisible pressures accumulating over time. When traditional pathways narrow and alternative ones are celebrated without scrutiny, people adapt in predictable ways. They choose what appears available. They prioritize what promises immediacy. They accept trade offs they once believed they would never make. This is not moral failure, it is human behavior responding to constraint. The tragedy lies not in the choice itself, but in the mismatch between expectation and reality. Many women enter these platforms believing they are stepping into control, only to discover that control is partial and temporary. Algorithms dictate reach, markets dictate value, time dictates decline. The longer one participates, the harder it becomes to leave cleanly. What begins as a solution quietly transforms into a trap defined by diminishing returns and increasing emotional cost. As the novelty fades, the emotional weight grows. The constant need to be visible, appealing, and responsive takes its toll. When income depends on attention, rest feels risky. When identity becomes content, privacy erodes. When validation is transactional, connection feels hollow. These costs rarely appear in promotional narratives, but they surface later in stories of burnout, regret, and quiet withdrawal. The permanence of the digital world compounds these outcomes. The internet does not forget. Decisions made under pressure follow people into future chapters of their lives. This reality shapes how women see their prospects, how they approach relationships, and how they plan for the future. Even when social attitudes shift, personal concerns linger. Reinvention becomes harder when the past is always accessible. Meanwhile, the absence of men as stabilizing partners remains one of the most misunderstood aspects of this moment. Men did not vanish suddenly. They responded gradually to years of messaging that framed their presence as optional or problematic. Rather than resist, many complied. They disengaged. They simplified. They found peace in solitude. That peace, once found, is not easily surrendered. And the expectation that men would eventually return to traditional roles ignores this adaptation. People rarely re enter systems they associate with risk and criticism, or once they discover alternatives that offer calm, This is not punishment or resentment. It is learning. Men adjusted their behavior to align with incentives, just as women are doing now. The difference is timing and visibility. For women, the consequences of this withdrawal are magnified by economic realities. Without shared expenses or emotional support, the cost of independence rises sharply. Single incomes stretch thinner. Financial shocks hit harder. Long term planning becomes more difficult. In that environment, short term survival strategies gain appeal even when they undermine future stability. The result is a society where both men and women are responding rationally to irrational conditions, but in different ways. Men retreat to minimize risk, women adapt to maintain income. Each response makes sense individually, but collectively they erode the foundations of cooperation and shared resilience. The gap widens, not because of malice, but because incentives push people apart. What makes this moment particularly fragile is the lack of honest conversation. Public discourse often swings between blame and denial, neither of which offer solutions. Blame alienates, denial delays. Meanwhile, individuals continue making decisions in isolation, believing their struggles are personal rather than systemic. This isolation deepens shame and reduces the likelihood of collective change. Honesty does not require cruelty. It requires acknowledging that empowerment narratives without structural support are incomplete, that independence without community is brittle, that flexibility without security is stressful, that choice without viable alternatives is constrained. Recognizing these truths does not strip people of agency, it grounds agency in reality. For women currently considering or participating in platforms like OnlyFans, the most important thing is not judgment, but information. Understand the guest it averages rather than outliers. Understanding long term implications rather than short term gains. Understanding how digital permanence affects future options. These considerations do not eliminate risk, but they allow for informed consent rather than hopeful assumption. For men, the challenge is recognizing that withdrawal, while protective, also shapes the world they inhabit. Peace found in solitude can coexist with meaningful connection, but rebuilding trust requires realistic expectations and shared responsibility. Without addressing the pressures that drove disengagement, calls for renewed participation will fall flat. At the societal level, the path forward requires recalibrating incentives. Affordable housing, stable employment, and supportive communities expand options and reduce desperation. When people have real choices, they make better decisions. When they do not, they adapt in ways that reflect survival rather than aspiration. Technology will continue to reshape labor. Digital platforms will continue to blur personal and professional boundaries. These trends are unlikely to reverse. What can change is how risks are distributed and how narratives are framed. Transparency, education, and realistic expectations can mitigate harm, even when uncertainty persists. The normalization of precarious work as empowerment should concern anyone invested in long term social stability. When survival strategies become aspirational, something has gone wrong. The goal should not be to shame individuals navigating difficult circumstances, but to question systems that leave so many feeling cornered. History shows that society functions best when cooperation is rewarded, not punished. When partnership, community, and long term planning are viable, people invest in them willingly. When those pathways are obstructed, people retreat into self preservation. The current moment reflects the latter condition, but it does not have to remain that way. Change begins with clarity. Clarity about how we arrived here, clarity about who benefits from current narratives, clarity about the costs we are asking individuals to bear quietly. Without this clarity, cycles repeat and damage accumulates. As this conversation reaches its conclusion, the most important takeaway is not condemnation, but awareness. Awareness that choices are shaped by context. Awareness that survival decisions carry long shadows. Awareness that telling people they are empowered does not make them secure. Awareness that men walking away was not an accident, but a response. This awareness invites reflection rather than outrage. Reflection on how we speak about independence. Reflection on how we value stability. Reflection on how we rebuild cooperation in a world that has quietly incentivized isolation. These are not simple questions, but they are necessary ones. Before we close, it matters to pause and ask what you think about what was discussed here. Do you agree with the direction things appear to be moving? Do you see similar patterns in your own life or among people you know? Your perspective matters because these issues are not abstract. They are lived experiences shaping real outcomes. Leave a comment and share your thoughts so this conversation can continue beyond this video. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.